Good morning, everyone. We're going to get underway here in a moment, if you can find a place. I want to welcome you to the night conference center at the Newseum. My name is Charles Haynes, and on behalf of the Religious Freedom Center of the Newseum Institute, the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation, and Tanenbaum Center, we are delighted to have you here today. I wasn't going to do this, but I can't help it. Where is he? My good friend, Ambassador David Saperstein, is here, and it's such a rare sighting for me to see him because he's all over the world that I wanted to acknowledge that he's with us today. Where does David go? Did he already leave? I knew it was going to last long, so. And he does this to me every time I want to acknowledge him. He's out of the room, then he comes back in later. But he is in the building. We know that. And I also want to say thank you to my good friend and mentor, because we built this center, Religious Freedom Center, here so much on the vision of the Williamsburg Charter. So I can't help but say how grateful I am that Oz Guinness is with us today over there. I almost canceled this program and said, let's just let Oz speak because we don't get him often enough in here, but this is an important topic, so we'll stick with the program. There you are. Once again, you did this to me. I was acknowledging you're here and thanking you, and then you weren't in the room. There is Ambassador David Saperstein. Thank you for being here. There's so many old friends here, and great. This is such an important topic and occasion, so thank you for being here. The Religious Freedom Center of the Newseum Institute, as I think most of you know, is deeply committed to promoting the religious liberty principles of the First Amendment and the Universal Declaration of Rights. It's our view, following the Williamsburg Charter's vision, it's our view that these are the principles that enable us to live with one another across differences in faith and belief. And so we're committed to helping people understand that crucial part of our life together in this country and around the world. For example, we are launching this spring, I have to say what's new, our first blended learning courses on religious freedom for emerging and current religious leaders. We believe that we need to get in that business of preparing religious leadership in this country to use these religious liberty principles in their engagement with one another, in their communities, with their congregations. So we are starting that this spring as kind of a pilot, and we hope to expand it. They will actually be here as part of the blended learning. They will be here for several days in March, and I hope many of you will be inviting some of you to engage with them, and I hope you'll be helping us to do that. And I also hope that in other ways, I know many of you represent various faith communities, will help us as we build this out and reach especially emerging leadership in the various faith communities in the United States to really understand and apply these principles in their lives and in their work. Well, today's topic, religious freedom in the workplace, couldn't be more important. It's an essential part of that. It's not only good for business, as Brian Grimm has eloquently reminded us, but it is also, of course, religious freedom in the workplace, essential condition for peaceful coexistence, not only in this country, but around the world. And so that's why this is such a critical topic, and Brian's groundbreaking work on this and the pledge that he will talk about today, I think provides us with a vision forward, a way forward in workplaces. So we are delighted to be part of that and to support that effort. And we are also very honored that Senator Smith is here to talk about this today with us. And then you'll see a distinguished panel of people who have tremendous expertise and experience on this to engage these issues from their various perspectives. And there are a lot of different perspectives on these issues. So this is going to be, I think, an amazing discussion. So let's get right to it. It's my pleasure to start us off by introducing to you the CEO of Tanenbaum. which I think, as most of you know, if not everyone, is responsible for doing tremendous work to promote understanding across differences, not only in the workplace, but in other arenas. And Joyce Dubensky, the CEO of Tanenbaum, is going to tell you a little bit about the important work that they're doing. Joyce, I'll turn it to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay, you're now going to see me manage this. Glad to be with you. Good morning. It's really an honor to be here and to be with two of my heroes, both Charles and Brian are visionaries, and so this is particularly special personally. Today's discussion about religious freedom is really important. We know that it's a powerful value, one that can be a force for stability and peace, as Brian so often reminds us. But religion and our beliefs are part of people's core identities as well, whether you are a believer or a non-believer. And that makes religious freedom, meaning freedom of belief, relevant no matter where you sit on the political spectrum. And it's also an issue for workplaces, not only because workplaces need stability and stable economies to thrive, but because their employees and their customers have beliefs, and they're relevant. They bring them to the workplace, and they bring them to their decisions about what they're going to purchase. So it's important for global companies from a business perspective. This is an issue that at Tanenbaum we've been addressing for going on 20 years. And in that time, what we've learned is that, yes, religion is a workplace issue and one that can create challenges. It's not simple. We can all believe in religious freedom in the workplace, but it's hard to actually make that happen. But it's in a company's self-interest to address it, and that there are actually practical ways that they can do so proactively. These days, it kind of seems intuitive that discussions about religion are happening in the workplace. That wasn't always the case. Lots of people used to believe, you want to get along with folks, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion. At least that's what my mother told me. But today people are talking about religion. Since Paris, San Bernardino, Beirut, ISIS, fear of terrorism in all its forms, but often that's conflated with people who follow Islam, political debates, our refugee crisis. These are all issues that are raising religion, and it's happening over lunch, and it's happening at the water fountain. And with this, we're seeing an escalation of reports of terrible acts against American Muslims, harassment, children being bullied and called names, outright workplace discrimination, and hate crimes. So we expect it to be in the workplace today, and those things are also happening in the workplace. We have data that rounds out this picture. A couple of years ago, Tanenbaum conducted a nationwide survey of the American worker, and it's really a case study for global companies of what's going on vis-a-vis religion in the workplace. What we found is that religion is being talked about. More than 1 in 5 people are talking about religion with their co-workers a couple of times a month. And 15%, an additional 15%, are talking about religion every day or once a week with their co-workers. In addition to that, people report that there's bias in the workplace, that bringing one's religion or one's belief to the workplace can be a problem, and it can really be troubling for them. So 1 in 3 workers say that they have personally experienced or witnessed somebody experiencing religious bias in their workplace. The groups that are most affected, predictably, it's the people who are in a minority tradition in this country: Jews, Muslims, Baha'is. But that's not all. The other two groups that say that they're most affected, atheists and white evangelical Protestants. This is a challenge for the global workplace. And global companies need to address it. Global companies are in business for a reason, to provide products and services and to make money. They're not in business in order to promote our ethical and core values, but they can, and it's actually aligned with their interest. If they want to succeed, they need three things. They need the right team, the right marketing, and the right product. And interestingly, religion can influence whether they get the right team, the right marketing, and the right customers, and the right product. Religious bias can derail a global company if it's happening in their workplace, and proactively addressing it can help them to succeed. What do I mean? Well, if a company wants to succeed, they need the best talent. The best talent does not come in one shape, one size, or one religion. The best talent comes from the people who have the smarts, the capacity, the ability, the drive. So you want to go to the pool where you can find these people. So you need a reputation as a company that says that you are a diversity-friendly and religious diversity, belief diversity-friendly company. So quick story, and one that I often tell because I think it's so important. We were talking to a major financial company. You would know the name, but I'm not allowed to repeat it here. And the woman said to me, you know, we just lost this wonderful candidate. We were really recruiting hard for her. She was going to manage one of our areas, and she was really great, and she went to our competitor. So I called her, and I asked her why. Why did she choose the competitor? And her answer was, they're known to be more hijab friendly. Now that's not something that's in the news per se. That's in the social media. That's people talking to each other. That's your reputation. But once companies get that reputation, that they're religious diversity friendly, and once they get the talent, how do they keep them? Because retaining talent is important. It costs a lot of money to replace good people. It can cost between 100 and 150% of someone's annual salary to do that. And you not only want to keep them, you want to keep them and you want to keep them happy so that they're functioning well. Because disengaged people cost a lot of money as well. Billions of dollars are lost every year in this country due to lack of productivity. So here's the good news. Our survey shows that when you have the proactive policies, this can actually make a difference in improving morale and therefore in retention. One example, for companies that had flexible hours about accommodating religious observance, we found that there was a direct correlation with people being happier about going to work and higher morale. For companies that had clear complaint processes where you could register a concern and believe it would be heard, we found that that cut in half the number of people looking for other jobs. So your retention and your morale can be directly affected by how you address belief diversity in your workplace. But having religious diversity in your workplace can also be a marketing benefit, and it can help you select and promote the best products. So, another story, what do I mean? In Germany, there was another financial services company, but this time they were promoting savings accounts, and they did a whole ad campaign, and they designed it with piggy banks. And then they had some of their staff advise them that this could be problematic for one of their target markets, because one of their target markets in Germany were Turkish Muslim refugees who might not be drawn to piggy banks. So they kept the ad campaign, but they substituted the pig with a treasure chest. And if you were looking at the news, I think it was yesterday, H&M, a retailer, is now being slammed because it's selling scarves that many people think mock the talit, and the tallis worn within the Jewish tradition for prayer by men, and by many women, depending on how they believe. So this is the business case for addressing religious diversity in the workplace. It's to actively combat that bias that emerges and to proactively accommodate so that people who bring their religious beliefs to work can do so and can actually feel comfortable doing so. It's possible to be proactive. That's what we work with companies on. We've identified 10 bias danger signs. I'm not going to go through them now. And we help companies develop the policies and the practices to recognize them proactively and develop policies and practices to address them before they become a problem. That you can give training within companies. You can raise the issue and promote things. We know companies that right now are looking at the tenor of what's going on in our country and are sending out materials to their staff about how to acknowledge and not mistreat their American Muslim colleagues because they're all part of one community within that workplace. That's what can be done to create a corporate culture that's characterized what we call a Tanenbaum as the accommodation mindset. It's something that involves honoring the different beliefs of people, trying your best to find ways to accommodate their religious needs, so long as it doesn't unduly burden the company. Because after all, your business is in business to do business. So let me close with where I started. Religious freedom is a foundational, fundamental, powerful value and force. It's critical to bring respect for religion and religious diversity and diversity of belief and non-belief into the workplace. It's good for business and it's good for society. But finally, we have to remember it isn't simple. Different beliefs bring differences into the workplace, and they can bring different competing interests. So our responsibility is to manage behavior and how we treat one another. Differences have to be managed. The best companies, the most successful companies that we see are doing that already proactively. And we need more to step up because after all, it's good business. Thank you.
Let's see.
You're not getting it.
I don't get it. Oh no, I've been taken down a peg already before I even began. Well, thank you everyone for coming today, and it's so good to have many of you with us, colleagues that I've known for many years, friends. I even have a friend from college here who's much younger than I am, and some other special guests that I'll recognize. So if you haven't looked at it already, look at the corporate pledge, which is on the back of the program for today. And my comments are going to focus specifically on the corporate pledge, and I'm going to give its history because I think it's enlightening to where this has come from and then where I hope it's going. First, the title of religious freedom here is called Freedom of Religion or Belief, or Freedom of Religion and Belief. That's really an international formulation coming from Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that essentially protects people's rights to have a faith, change their faith, or have no faith at all. And so that's what's meant by that. And the history of this document, like the history of a company or a business, is really the history of the people who made it and continue to make it day after day. The idea for the corporate pledge began in the Middle East in the 1990s when the vice president of my foundation, Greg Clark, was the managing legal counsel for Occidental Petroleum. And in his work, he observed how State Department people from the British and Foreign Commonwealth Office would often try to promote human rights in the region where he was working, and they were met by governments with polite, but not too much follow-up on what they were saying. And then at the same time, he saw his corporate leaders from Occidental expressing concerns about how employees were treated, concerns about the business, and those were treated as a high priority by the governments that they were dealing with. So businesses are a very powerful force in this world, and I argue they're a very powerful force for religious freedom because they are at the crossroads of creativity, commerce, and culture, having to manage all these things within them, and are a powerful force. Well, at the same time Greg was having his career in the Middle East, I was working in Kazakhstan and heading up the first faith-based organization in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, as it was known then. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the new president and current president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, immediately announced support for religious freedom. And the first act that he did was to hand over to my organization, the former Communist Party training school, and asked that it be turned into a business institute. So immediately in his mind, a connection between free markets and freedom of religion was made. And he thought that was a very powerful force. As a result, Kazakhstan that he envisioned was a place where Muslims, Christians, and people of various faiths could work together to build a new country. Well, that's a bit of ancient history, maybe as my grandkids would say. But since then, in the years, my colleague Greg Clark has left corporate law in the Middle East, and he's volunteered for his church as a legal and religious freedom representative in Brazil, and that's coming up to where this came from. At the same time, I was working at the Pew Research Center when Greg moved to Brazil, measuring religious freedom, and he challenged me to look at the correlation between religious freedom and socioeconomic outcomes, which is very plain and solid. Where I've published with Greg and a number of others articles at the World Economic Forum. I'll be going to Davos next week, and we're looking at how religious and economic freedoms are related, the future of markets as it relates to religion. And what we find is that where religious freedom and diversity that arises with it are protected and respected, sustainable long-term economic development is more likely. One of the main causal links behind this is that religious freedom is directly related to more peaceful, less conflictual societies. And for everybody except bullet and bomb makers, that's good for business. So you can find more about that in a book that I wrote with Roger Finke, The Price of Freedom Denied. Well, it was in Brazil where these ideas started coming together. And the corporate pledge came about was really as I left Pew and started the Religious Freedom and Business platform as a way to study and make known the connections between religious freedom and business. We first launched the foundation in Brazil in 2014. We had the vice president of Brazil, Michel Temer, there, but also leading business people. And one of the person who sat on the board of maybe a dozen different corporations in Brazil said, I really support religious freedom. We don't say anything about that in our corporate documents. Could you suggest some language for us? And voila. You have the document before him. Two corporate lawyers, if I can ask them to stand up, Gavin Parker and Rob Ellis, where are you? Right here. They took the challenge to translate this idea of providing some language that a CEO could use in their documents, and you have these principles along with a whole packet of other corporate documents that businesses can use to show support for freedom of religion or belief, interfaith understanding, and peace in their corporate documents. And then we've had through I guess over the past year, Charles Haynes convenes it's called the Religious Freedom Roundtable, or Committee on Religious Liberty. There's just so many names, but we had a meeting, I think in this room or here earlier or last year where these documents were presented, and then we had Dan Mack and Richard Foltin. Are they here? If they could stand up, they'll be joining our panel. They're up here in the front. They, from the ACLU and American Jewish Committee, both gave feedback on these documents. And also from Tanenbaum, the great team who's met you at the doors, Liz Jocelyn and Eliza Blanchard back here in the back, and Mark Fowler here in the front, gave a lot of feedback, and others were giving feedback. So what we're trying to come up with is a consensus document that business people, people from all across the spectrum can agree with. Well, this corporate pledge has been developed in the context also in a partnership that my foundation has with the United Nations. At the same time I was setting up the foundation, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was setting up the Business for Peace platform within the United Nations Global Compact. Together, we plan to hold an awards event for business leaders that are promoting interfaith understanding and peace during the Olympics in Brazil this coming summer, and highlighting the work that they do. Well, we're honored, if I can recognize someone else today, to have Y.W. Gennardi. Gennardi, here, if Gennardi could stand up for a minute. He's he's a chief corporate officer of the Rajawali Corporation, a business group that involves multiple businesses across Indonesia, and he's a true global leader in the practice and potential of business as a force for good. And I'll just give two examples among many from Gennardi that he's done. First, he helped enlist Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to come join us in Indonesia a little over a year ago to launch a publication called Business, a Powerful Force Supporting Interfaith Understanding and Peace. And so we launched this, and in it, we highlighted 4 ways that businesses today are currently promoting interfaith understanding and peace in the work that they're doing. One is that they're using marketing expertise to build bridges. Another is they're incentivizing innovation. A third, they're incubating and catalyzing social entrepreneurship. And fourth, they're supporting workforce diversity. And so you can read some of the case studies in that we launched in Indonesia. And since then, it's been translated into Portuguese, and we have other languages planned. And we launched it this past year at a global religious freedom forum in Brazil, hosted by the first mosque in Latin America, in Sao Paulo, the financial capital of Brazil, wherein we had over 700 business leaders and community leaders from Brazil attend that. So the work that Gennardi helped us get started is expanding. The second thing that he's done, and this is a whole story in itself, which I won't tell the whole story, but in Indonesia, 46 million children don't have birth certificates. And that means they can't qualify to get in the regular track for education or other kinds of social benefits that people in Indonesia had. In his company, he noticed this, and he's making the argument across businesses in Indonesia, look, if we don't solve this problem, we're going to have 46 million uneducated people who are susceptible to poverty, crime, extremism, affecting our country. So one of the things he's done is he's helped organize mass weddings, because the reason many of them don't have birth certificates is that the parents aren't married. And so mass weddings to bring people together to get married, and he does it in an interfaith way. So, as the Muslim ceremonies go on, the Catholic ceremonies going on, and the Hindu ceremonies going on, as a very practical way. And it takes business sense to solve social problems. Even though it's a government thing to issue birth certificates, it takes some real business know-how to help people see why that should be done and how to do it. So I thank Gennardi for being here, and he's going to the UN directly from here for the Business for Peace or the Young Global Compact Board of Directors meeting from here. And I don't know if Arnie Podgorski is here. Yes, thank you, Arnie. So this is the last the second to last recognition I'd like to give. He's a corporate lawyer here in D.C., and he works with Fuad Makhzoumi, a Lebanese billionaire in the gas and pipe business. Now, unfortunately, Fuad can't be with us. I was just recently with him. But his work is an example of how a businessman can, in a difficult part of the world, in Lebanon, sees religious freedom as critical for socioeconomic success. In addition to being an outspoken proponent of religious freedom, Makhzoumi has a foundation where he's helped train 400,000 people in Lebanon. That's 1 out of every 10 people in Lebanon have been trained by his foundation in job skills. Now, the interfaith and religious freedom part of that, he says, is if I would only do it for my people, the Sunni, he's Sunni Muslim, if I only do it for the Sunnis, it's going to create division. So his conviction is that the job training is for the Sunnis, the Shia, the Druze, the Christians, the Maronites, the Catholics, the whatever group, and to bring them together through business. So as he says, when people of all faiths have the opportunity to rise together, then the economy of a country can be successful. Now, finally, I want to really go back to ancient history, as my grandkids would say, and mention that I grew up in a house where business and faith were interacted quite naturally. My parents are here today, my dad and mom. Carlton and Stologrim. And my dad was a chief engineer for a major international company. He went to many of the countries that I go to now. But he was also the head of our church's building committee, a Boy Scout troop leader. He taught Sunday school. He participated in a stock club, raised a family. And all those activities just fit so naturally together. There wasn't, as I grew up in a house where business was discussed and he was off on business, there just wasn't a separation. It was everything that motivated my dad in his personal life also went into the business world and vice versa. And those activities fit naturally together with his faith and work providing an example to me of how the freedom to be who you are, wherever you are, is one of the great sources of innovation and human development. So thanks, Dad and Mom. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, another person who has done this balance, and I'll get to that part at the very end. But Senator Gordon Smith, is currently the president of the National Association of Broadcasters, beginning there in 2009. Before joining that, he served as a two-term U.S. Senator from the state of Oregon, and later was a senior advisor in the Washington offices of Covington and Burling, LLP. During his tenure in the U.S. Senate, Senator Smith's committee assignments included the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee. It's the panel that oversees broadcast-related legislation. He also served on the Senate Energy and National Resources Committee, the Senate Finance Committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and his role in the Commerce Committee as chairman of the Senate High Tech Task Force helped foster his interest in new media and new technology issues, something this whole institution is even dedicated to. He was born in Portland, Oregon. He attended Brigham Young University, received his law degree from Southwestern University of Law in Los Angeles, and practiced law in New Mexico and Arizona before returning to Oregon to direct the family-owned Smith Frozen Foods business in Weston, Oregon. Before his election to the U.S. Senate in 1996, he was elected to the Oregon State Senate, rising to the position of president of that body after only 3 years. Do you still live in Bethesda with your wife, Sharon, and have 3 children and 2 grandchildren? Now, to the part that I think is the most interesting, he also serves as an Area 70. Now, to those of you who are not members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons, that might not mean anything, but it means that he has like triple jobs. He's doing all this other work, but it's a non-paid church position, which I'm Catholic, so in Catholic terms, it would be like being an archbishop cardinal over a huge territory in the Northeast United States. And so, that another example of a faith where people are at work, and yet they're constantly practicing their faith and working on their faith. So we thank you for taking time, not only from your busy work schedule, but from your busy church schedule, to come and share about religious diversity, religion, and business. Thank you, Senator Smith.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Don't know how I got selected to be your keynote speaker, but I am truly honored for this designation and hope to share with you some thoughts that you will find worthwhile. Both Joyce and Brian mentioned the difficult intersection between politics and religion. In my own family, that was inescapable because I'm the 8th of 10 children of Mylan Smith and Jessica Udall. And when I was 2 years old, we moved from Oregon to Washington, D.C., where my father served as the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture and later as President Eisenhower's cabinet coordinator. And when you have a mother by the name of Udall, you tend to be nurtured in an ethic of public service. And so when I was a very little boy, I had this ambition to do something in public life, and that ultimately never died and led me both to the Oregon State Senate and to the United States Senate, representing the state of Oregon. But in all of that, in all of my 63 years, and particularly in my formative years, religion was an essential and constant around our dinner table and around the family lives of Mylan and Jessica Smith. And so politics and religion were constantly taught. One of the things that I have noted as a U.S. Senator, and when I served there on the Foreign Relations Committee, I often told audiences that of all of the commerce, all the business that America does, it had no greater export than the values of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and specifically the Bill of Rights, because they're part and parcel of what is sometimes called by us the American dream, but actually they're really the distillation of the human experience that has led to the human dream. I love these words. They were written by the direction of the First Continental Congress. They tasked a man sometimes described as a Christian, sometimes described as a deist, and sometimes described as a secularist, one Thomas Jefferson, to pen this document. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Benjamin Franklin, who helped edit the original draft by Thomas Jefferson, along with John Adams, was once asked why it was described as the pursuit of happiness. Why wasn't it just guaranteed that there be happiness? And the woman who asked the question and received the answers, well, happiness is something you have to catch if you can. Government could not guarantee it. Abraham Lincoln used this sentence. This sentence I've just read to you has been called one of the best known in all of the English language, containing the most potent and consequential words in American history. Abraham Lincoln believed that this sentence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," was the prism through which American behavior should be judged, and that of its government. And it certainly formed the basis of his political philosophy. Abraham Lincoln did something very unimaginable to our modern times. He used to, in the midst of a civil war, open the White House one day a week to anyone who wanted to come in and talk to him. Can you imagine what he must have heard in a day when the battles of the Civil War would regularly result in the deaths of 10,000 soldiers? I had no such experience in my public life, but I used to regularly hold town halls in Oregon. And one of the things I remember about town halls in Oregon is the emotion with which feelings were expressed. Sometimes they were totally untethered to an understanding of constitutional law or legal processes, and they were often expressed with great passion and with religious fervor. In all of those town halls, one of the things I remember best was a particular question put to me by a woman who said, "Senator Smith, when you think of all of our constitutional rights, which of those is most important?" And before I answered her, I thought, well, whichever one I need the most right now. But I felt impressed to tell her that of all of our constitutional rights, I thought the most important were those in the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment. I expressed the belief that they were probably the most important because they put them first. But they're not just one. They're actually a group of rights that are distinct from one another, but actually they are tethered closely to one another. They're reinforcing and supportive of one another. They are the prohibition against the state's establishment of a religion, the promise of the free exercise of religion, the promise of freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, association, and the right to petition our government with grievances that we have. Well, they all hang together. They can be summed up as the right of conscience. But it's interesting that the framers didn't put it as the right of conscience, and they put it as the right of free exercise of religion. Because they understood, having brought this nation together out of all the diverse religious denominations that came here. I mean, the Puritans to Massachusetts, the Quakers to Pennsylvania, the Baptists to Georgia, the Catholics to Maryland. They had to figure out how to make it all work. So they prohibited an establishment and they guaranteed a free exercise of religion. Well, certainly these rights of the First Amendment all hang together and they enjoy a special, I believe, constitutional status. But what's interesting is we live in an increasingly secular time. I remember once being asked at another town hall why I had not introduced any bill to require prayer in public schools. And I felt impressed to ask that questioner, well, when's the last time you had family prayer? It was a stumper. And I suggested, well, you know, the court would have never taken prayer out of public schools had you not taken it out of your home first. In the end, the court is a reflection of us. Our government is a reflection of we, the people. And so this very conference here today is probably something of a byproduct that what used to be self-evident no longer is. And it falls to us to stand up and speak for the freedom of religion in all contexts. And so when I thought about what I should say to you, I thought, okay, how does the freedom of religion affect me? How does it affect me as a businessman? How does it affect me as a former public official? Well, again, they're all related. It's hard to break them apart. When I served as the chairman of the European Affairs Subcommittee on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it was my privilege to watch our European neighbors and our cousins put together a constitution for the continent of Europe. In that role, I had the opportunity to watch closely development of the European Charter. I observed the best legal minds in Europe wrestle without success to frame a workable constitution for the peoples of all Europe's nations. It caused me to reflect on the deep moral and religious foundations of our own Constitution. Indeed, I found myself agreeing all the more with John Adams, his assessment that, quote, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Now, I don't believe Adams was saying that America could have a government of limited powers because Americans largely govern themselves. I think he was saying they have an allegiance to a higher law so that they could have minimalist government. He was not advocating a theocracy. He understood that the affairs of state, such as the regulation of commerce, the financing of government, the coining of money, the prosecution of wars, are very much the affairs of this world, and therefore secular. But he recognized in the tradition of the English Enlightenment that the ordered liberty provided for by our form of government not only tolerated religion, but actually required religion and morality to inform the sometimes grubby details of political debate. I thought, how can I demonstrate this principle of governing ourselves so we don't need a big government? When I was a little boy in this area, growing up as a Latter-day Saint, there was a youth leader who was a local leader who became a general leader in my church. He was a Navy pilot for 26 years. And I remember a story that he taught me that informed my own life's conduct. He said that as a Navy pilot, his name, by the way, was Hartman Rector. You don't necessarily need to know him, or probably certainly don't know him. But I remember him teaching us that as a pilot, there's a long list of things you had to do, and that you did them in order to be safe. But that a lot of flying got to be kind of boring. And when it got to be boring, many of his colleagues and fellow pilots used to get really low to the ground and fly in and out of the trees. And so these commandments of how to operate a government plane, you followed. But they had to add another one, don't fly in the trees, which was a man-made law. Because when you got too close to the trees and you had any difficulty, you would crash. You had no room for any mistake. In my own life, and in my life as a father, I used to say to my kids, because I taught them this same story, that the commandments of God, if you keep them, make it easy to keep the commandments of the land, the laws of the land, because you're flying above them. And whenever they would get a little too low in altitude, I would say, Brittany, Garrett, you're flying too close to the trees. Keeping God's laws keeps us well above man's laws. And they give us safety, and they allow us to find peace. Religion's value to the individual, to the commercial world, and to civic life of the American people is totally interconnected, interrelated, and create a virtuous circle. Another of the things I used to do as a U.S. Senator was to regularly accept invitations to different religious services and ceremonies. I learned from my Oriental brothers and sisters that the Hindu teachings, the Buddhist teachings, and even the secular teachings of Confucius were basically behavioral teachings. I remember attending a wonderful service of a Jewish rabbi. He spoke on the durable value of the Ten Commandments, of worshiping God, of honoring parents, of keeping the Sabbath day, of prohibitions against idolatry and blasphemy, murder, adultery, profanity, theft, dishonesty, covetousness. And I thought to myself as I listened to this learned rabbi, you know, if the American people actually did that, we'd have a lot less to do in the Senate. And we could certainly have a smaller government. One of my friends in Islam in Oregon taught me about the 7 pillars of Islam: guardianship, purity, prayer, charity, fasting, pilgrimage, the Hajj, and then, of course, struggle. And you know that many of our Islamic brothers and sisters are struggling to figure out what that means in terms of jihad. For most overwhelming numbers of Islamists, jihad means just the struggle and not violence. But what I'm most familiar with are the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and what I find most helpful, both in my individual life, in my life as a businessman, in my service in public life, is to reflect upon, and I say what I am because what I'm familiar with, and in no way designed to offend anyone who is not of one of the branches of Christianity. It's interesting to me what Jesus taught and what he did not teach. He lived in a time of great persecution and oppression by the Roman Empire, but he didn't teach political science, except to say to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God, which I think imposes on us a duty to struggle with both. There's great military oppression, but he didn't teach military science. He didn't teach political science. He did a lot of healing, but he didn't teach health care or how to deliver it. It was a time of great poverty, probably severe lack of nutrition, but he didn't teach agriculture or nutrition. But what he did, along with other great religious leaders, was to teach personal conduct and rules by which we can govern ourselves, of meekness, of humility, of thirsting after righteousness, of loving our enemies, blessing those that curse us, to do good for those that hate you, to pray for them when they despitefully use you and persecute you, to serve one another, to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us, to seek the things of heaven, to lay up treasure there, and to love one another. These are things about personal conduct. And so how does that translate into the workplace, into the public square? Perfectly. Who wouldn't want an employee that had those kinds of character qualities? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I probably have spoken long enough, but we live in a day of tribulation. But these things that have come to us through inspiration of heaven have been given to us in many traditions, and in my own, that we might have peace, that we might be of good cheer, because this overcomes the world. Now, the greatest struggle and threat, I suppose, to religious freedom today is by an increasingly secular society. And today, the issues, whether that involves when does life begin? Or what is the definition of a family? I might suggest to you that religious people should find some refuge in a concept known as fairness for all. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes observed the Constitution is, quote, made for a people of fundamentally different views. The senates that I served in were designed from the beginning of the constitutional experiment to foster compromise. Today, compromise, honorable compromise, is regarded as something of a pejorative, a dirty word. But actually it is the core of the American genius that we can find honorable compromise. As a devout and believing and practicing Latter-day Saint, and as a former U.S. Senator, I was the author of virtually all gay rights legislation except for redefining marriage. You just simply have to check the congressional record to find that to be true. Many of my colleagues of different religious persuasions wondered why I would compromise in such a way with things which they regarded as fundamentally evil. I told them that I found my guide in this regard to one of the most beautiful stories in the New Testament, where a woman was brought to Jesus, supposedly taken in the very act of adultery, and told that according to the law she must be stoned to death. This was done to entrap him, and his answer was, I believe, merciful and brilliant. He risked his life in the public square. He did not condone her sin, but he simply said to those her accusers, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." So if the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally different views, how ought religious people deal with this cognitive dissonance? I believe it is for looking and struggling and striving to find fairness for all. And I close with a quote from a learned jurist and today a great American religious leader in my church by the name of Elder Dallin H. Oaks. He's a former dean of the University of Chicago Law School, Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court, often on the short list for the U.S. Supreme Court, but now a full-time servant in the LDS faith. Judge Oaks, Elder Oaks, said, "Differences on precious fundamentals are with us forever. We must not let them disable our democracy or cripple our society. This does not anticipate that we will deny or abandon our differences, but that we will learn to live with those laws, institutions, and persons who do not share them. We may have cultural differences, but we should not have culture wars." May I end by simply saying I am thankful that I live in a land where religious freedom exists. Sometimes we are asked, well, if it's free, what is it worth? It is my experience as an individual, as an employer, and as a public servant that the contribution of religious freedom to American life is beyond price. Thank you.
So to respond to some of the things that have been said, but also to bring in some of the hotter topics that are in the news related to religion and the workplace, we have a very distinguished panel. So I'll be inviting Senator Smith, if you can come up and take the second chair down here, and then Joyce Dubensky, the CEO of Tanenbaum, to come up next. Dwayne Leslie. Dwayne is the Associate Director in the Department of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty and Director of Legislative Affairs for the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Daniel Mack, the Director of the ACLU Program on Freedom of Religion and Belief. And, I'm sorry, I jumped out of order. Richard, if that's okay. Richard Foltin, the Director of the National and Legislative Affairs of the American Jewish Committee's Office of Government and International Affairs. And then last but certainly not least, Zainab Al-Suwaij, the Executive Director and Co-Founder of the American Islamic Congress. So to kick off, I'm going to, if my lapel mic works, to kick off the discussion, I think perhaps many people are aware of the recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling last June in favor of Samantha Eloff, an American Muslim woman who wears a hijab, and she was denied a job at Abercrombie & Fitch when she was 17 years old. She claimed that the company didn't offer a job because of her religious identity, and specifically because of her hijab didn't match their looks policy. Well, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1, which is a very strong ruling in favor of Eloff. So if I can throw out to the panel, and each can feel free to chime in or not on each issue, but what are some of the various ways that U.S. laws and policies do protect people in the workplace from discrimination in hiring, firing, and advancement?
I can start.
Okay.
Thank you very much. What a great event to start the day with. The issue of Samantha Eloff, I worked on it personally, closely with the defending team. And it's actually, things have changed from many years. I remember many years ago when I was, over 20 years ago, I was applying for a job, and the lady who was applying to, she asked me, are you going to wear the same thing that you are wearing right now? At that time, I, of course, didn't know about all of these rules and regulations, so I understood her answer as a no. But I didn't pursue any other action because I personally didn't know that there is such a thing that you can go and talk about this issue and defend your right, and you cannot be discriminated because of your religion or color or background. When this case came last year was very interesting because I felt I'm the same person, or my case was represented in her. And but that at this time I certainly worked on the issue, worked on the religious freedom in workplace, and I understand more than what I understood over 20 years ago. It's very interesting because she felt discriminated at a certain place, but also her right, she gained her right back. And this is the kind of things that many people do not know about, especially when we talk about the Muslim community. They lack these kind of education and or information, in better words, about their rights here in this country. So we see many incidents like that. Every time I go somewhere, I talk about, I hear some people talking about how they've been discriminated against in their workplace, or they have not been giving 5 minutes during the day to pray, or they cannot take half an hour or an hour on a Friday to go to prayer, or, for example, they cannot handle pork and alcohol if they are working in a supermarket, and the pressure that they have. Many people do not know that they are afraid they've been fired from their work place. But when I explain to them, that they have rights, this is like a new information for them. It's very interesting to feel that you are protected by law and you have that support to pursue your life freely, and at the same time you have a way that you are proud of your heritage, your religion, the way where you come from, but at the same time you have a government that support and guarantee, or you have a constitution that support and guarantee your right to the country.
I'd like to amplify on Zainab's remarks by taking a step back and talking for a moment about the specific federal law that protects against discrimination. Of course, in 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which included religion as a protected category. One could not be discriminated against on the basis of their religion. What was left unresolved was whether or not the failure to provide an accommodation of a religious practice, which meant that in effect a person with a religious practice could be required being treated a little bit different than others, so that they could work there, was protected under the Civil Rights Act as well. And in the face of that uncertainty, Congress amended the Civil Rights Act in 1972 to say that it is an act of religious discrimination to fail to provide a reasonable accommodation for an employee unless there's an undue hardship for the employer. So that was a sea change, but it is also the case, this is always the case with law, that there's a lot of, then and now there were unsettled questions as to what's a reasonable accommodation and what's an undue hardship. And so to this day, while there is definitely a level of protection that's there, and happily you have successive administrations going back to the 1990s that have taken religious discrimination much more seriously than was the case prior to that time, there remain situations that seemed unresolved. And one of the great things about this Abercrombie and Fitch case is that one of the unresolved issues was whether it was discriminatory to have a look policy, to say we have a certain look in our establishment and we don't want to hire people that don't match that look, so we're not discriminating against you on the basis of religion, we're just treating you the same as everyone else. And while this case on its, sort of on its face is about a procedural issue, whether or not the employer can be willfully ignorant of a need for religious accommodation, I think anybody who reads that case and thinks that the court now would not rule against lookism policies, I think is missing a big message. So it's an evolving situation, but the important message is that there is a inclination, I think, based upon what the court has and the Supreme Court has now done, for there to be greater protections for religious minorities when they require some kind of differential treatment in order to respect their faith and also allow them to earn a livelihood.
So, that raises a good question. How far should businesses go to accommodate? Where is this reasonable accommodation? So in the news last week and in the weeks before, there's a group of Somalis who are working in a Cargill plant out in Colorado, and essentially they went on strike, or they stopped coming to work because they said the company wasn't providing the appropriate time for them to have their Friday prayers. And so they've withdrawn. Cargill said they were doing their best, but in a meat packing facility, there's an assembly line going on with perishable foods, and it's hard to accommodate. Any comments from anyone on where are the limits? Yeah.
Brian, one of the things I think that's particularly instructive in that case is that, and again, one of the reasons that I think you came up with having this pledge, because it is good for business, because it can't be good for business to fire 190 employees all at the same time. So obviously there's a good business reason to find a reasonable accommodation so that we can find ways to accommodate the religious belief, but still not impact the overall function of the business, because I don't think it's ever in anyone's interest to have wide-scale firings like that.
And one of the questions in these cases, an important one, is how far must the company go to accommodate, and I think we can address that more. But I want to emphasize that the process is similarly important, and there's a give and take. There is a duty on the employer to accommodate. There is also some duty on the employees to make sure the employer is aware of the need for an accommodation. That was one of the issues that came up in the Abercrombie case, and that one, as Justice Scalia said, was really easy in that case because it was quite clear what was going on. But in many other situations, I think a lot of these conflicts can be avoided if the process is followed, and the process involves making the employer aware of the need for an accommodation, having a back and forth, how far must the accommodation go. The employee can have an important role to play in that as well.
I was just going to say, I think the Cargill case, at least as much as I've seen so far, shows the complexity of the issue. If I understand it correctly, the employer was accommodating for many years. They had a practice of accommodating the religious practices of its Muslim employees. And this really had to do with scheduling in order to keep their business going. Now, that's what they say, and that's their public position. And then we also know about the employees who needed time to pray and felt they had to take a stand to maintain a core belief. I think that shows the complexity. It looked like there wasn't a lot of communication at a certain point. After that, and there's a question why that broke down. I think we have more to learn about this case in order to really opine on it. But I think that you have a company that, at least on its face, apparently was doing some amount of reasonable accommodation. And the question is an open one, I think, at this moment. Did they have a responsibility to go much further? Or could they go not much further when no one would talk with them on the other side? Because they apparently, or they said, they reached out to those employees and said, we can't have you not coming in. You're going to be fired. That's our policy. And it's unclear what happened. So I think we have to recognize the complexity of these issues. I think it goes to what you were saying earlier, Senator, about the importance of how can we be fair in practice.
Right.
But what does that mean? Because remembering, Cargill is in business to do business.
But I think one of the points that you've made is really valuable in just the mediation, the discussion. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this. Now with a sort of table full of lawyers here.
I'm not practicing.
Not practicing. But, you could take that comment the wrong way. The right way, I mean, it is that one of the very important skills in the law profession is mediation, to head things off before they have to be litigated. I think that that's a great point. Yeah, Richard.
I think to add to that, the law does say that you don't have to provide a reasonable accommodation if it's an undue burden. But I think an employer who has failed to interact with the employee, where it's clear it's the employee who has failed to interact, is going to may have a hard time convincing a court that there's an undue burden because they have failed to go through this preliminary step. So even if in the end there's no accommodation, that process is very important, and of course it has to be a good faith process. But I do also want to note, though, in this particular case that we've been discussing, it is the case under a Supreme Court case that, assuming you've got a number of different reasonable accommodations, it's not the employee can't dictate to the employer which reasonable accommodation to adopt. And so one question obviously will be, if the employer says, I would like to move to another accommodation, there will be a question as to whether that one is now reasonable, since they had one that was reasonable before. But that option is there. But having an interaction will always be beneficial, I think, to both sides, and if they're going to prevail, if ultimately they wind up having to go to court.
I love what he said in terms of both sides, and it's really about having open communication and sharing between the employer and the employee. I can speak from experience as the owner of a large frozen vegetable processing company. I hope you're all eating your peas and corn because we got too many in inventory. That said, where our facility, Smith Frozen Foods, is located is in eastern Oregon on the Oregon-Washington border. In that community, there are large numbers of Seventh-day Adventists, Latter-day Saints, and evangelical Christians. And in that area, because many of them work for our company, we have an ongoing dialogue. When you're harvesting peas or corn, these are very perishable products, and time is of the essence. But what we have is an ongoing open discussion with our Seventh-day Adventist employees and our other observant Christians who want to keep the Sabbath day holy as they read the requirement to do some trade-offs and to let the Seventh-day Adventists off on Saturday and the Mormons off on Sunday. And it's this constant effort to find substitutes, but understanding that the value to the business is that it's good business to have happy employees.
Oh, yeah.
And to have employees who go to synagogue, who go to their mosque, who go to their church, who go to their temple, to have those values that can't be very well taught by government or in public schools or other places, to get that involved in their soul, because they'll do a better job when they show up at Smith Frozen Foods, and your peas and corn will taste better.
Senator, just to add, I appreciate that, and that's a great example to see in business, but it's also incumbent, as you said, in the communication piece, that the employees should never be afraid to have that dialogue.
That's right.
The employer should say, we're willing to do this, but oftentimes you see people who need an accommodation who become afraid to actually speak up when given that opportunity.
Well, I want to take a little aside and call out the Seventh-day Adventists. Some of you have heard me give this story before, but you know the religious history of cornflakes?
No.
No? So, Battle Creek, Michigan, the Kellogg's brothers, well, they were Seventh-day Adventists, and Adventists, you know, follow Levitical teachings on diet, and they're nearly vegetarian.
Nearly, not
nearly. You could say, you know, but they were observing the American diet in those years of eggs and grease and ham and more grease, and they said there's got to be a better way to keep the temple of the Holy Spirit, our body, ready for, you know, godly action, and voila, cornflakes. So, and of course the debate between the Kellogg's brothers was how much sugar to put in, and the dark side won out.
We see what happened. We see what happened there, right?
But you know, what an example of, if you know, to accommodate religious minorities in the country, comes up with business innovations that really change the world, and provide nutrition at breakfast. It was really the concept. Yeah. Well, I want to shift a little bit to a hotter topic, if I can. And so this past week, 100 businesses in Georgia have formed what they call a partnership to oppose religious freedom legislation in the state legislature. And that sparked boycotts in Indiana, where some similar Religious Freedom Restoration Act legislation was being put through, tourism boycotts, and it was led by, some of these protests were led by Apple CEO Tim Cook, you know, opposing this religious freedom because, in the point of view of business and some others, that the legislation was also allowing for businesses to discriminate against the LGBT community, the LGBT gay community. So, you know, certainly, you know, we can't solve, you know, there's lots of big questions there. But the question of if and how to accommodate employees with a religious objection to same-sex marriage is a live issue. So, you know, how can companies balance this ostensible conflict between claims for rights from LGBT employees and religious employees? What role should companies, and then here's another one, just to make it a little more complicated, what role should companies play in publicly supporting or, as they've done, denouncing religious freedom legislation?
I've mentioned in my remarks, I've spent a lot of time on this issue of balancing the rights of the gay community with the standards of the religious community. I have not, I've only lived in Utah very briefly in my life. I am not a Utah official. I'm from the most secular state in America, the most unchurched state in America, called Oregon. And what I saw Utah do is actually admirable. It doesn't satisfy everyone on the hard right, and it offends the New York Times on the left. But basically what they did in Utah is the gay community, the LGBT community sat down with the religious community and said, what do you have to have and what do you need to protect? And they found a way to achieve what there is regarded as fairness for all. I would just simply invite other states to look at that as the model. It will not satisfy people on the hard left or the hard right, but it is a way to go forward. It is a way to find honorable compromise. It is a way to move beyond boycotts and hostility and culture wars, which I think ultimately are a great disservice, not just to business, but to American civic life.
I think it might be, the Utah situation might be difficult to replicate in other areas without getting too much into the weeds. The pre-existing law in Utah was of a different character than it is in most places in terms of the religious exemptions that it already provided. So I think the compromise there was eased by the fact of that pre-existing law. These are tough questions, the one you raised about how do we balance these issues. Some of these issues have come up in prior cases. So as we've heard, there's under federal law a requirement to accommodate religious exercise unless it imposes an undue hardship on the employer. And so one of the questions in cases like these, or like the issues that we're discussing about accommodating, for example, religious objections to, I don't know, serving LGBT customers or whatever it may be, is whether providing an accommodation for those objections would result in an undue hardship to an employer. And an undue hardship to an employer can come up in a variety of ways. It can be an undue hardship because it triggers coworker complaints or customer complaints, or it makes customers or coworkers feel shunned or would disrupt the workforce. So these are questions that have come up in prior cases. I think we're going to see a new era of them now, but we have to remember that one of the requirements, at least under federal law, is that employers have a duty to maintain a workplace that is free of harassment, and so that type of issue might come up in these contexts as well.
I think conscience issues are always challenging, and they bring up the question of not only whose rights, but even whose faith. Because, you know, very often we talk about the issue that you've just raised as the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community on the one hand and the religious community on the other. But of course, a majority of people who self-identify as LGBT are religious. So it's a misnomer to divide the two. Something that I've learned along the way in thinking about this, which was, I thought, very powerful, is that there are conscience issues that one would apply universally to every human that they could come in contact with. So for instance, if someone believes that life begins at conception and abortion is murder, if that is their heartfelt conviction, then they won't participate in an abortion. And they wouldn't participate in it if men could get pregnant and for any woman, no matter where she comes from. Universally applied conscience belief. The issue when we talk about same-sex marriage, when we talk about marriage equality, what we're really talking about is, I'm going to do these services for everyone who gets married, but not for your group because of your particular identity. And that is choosing to discriminate against a particular group, so that the impact of the conscience in that moment is qualitatively, it's not uniform, it's not for everybody. It actually has a consequence of taking a particular group within the society, which now has legal protection from the Supreme Court to marry, and saying, we're not going to recognize you as having the same rights as I do because you're gay. And so I think that's qualitatively different. That doesn't mean that the belief isn't heartfelt, but I think there may be a compelling interest in our society if we believe that everyone should be able to practice their faith, that a gay couple that wants to be married religiously should be just as free to marry religiously under a country whose laws say they can as a heterosexual couple. And that getting the services they need to do that, maybe we have a compelling interest in this country to allow for that legally if we believe that everyone is free to have their belief.
So we'll take Richard, and then we'll open for some questions from the audience for the panel.
I think the challenge here is, Senator Smith, I think, put it very well. We're a country and a constitution that was built on the notion that there are going to be profound differences among us often on the things that matter most and that define us as human beings. So I think in wrestling with these difficult issues, we have to ask ourselves, are we really doing something that's necessary to protect the basic liberties and rights of others, or are we doing something where we're trying to impose on others our particular perspective? And so, looking at the way that Joyce has portrayed the issue, surely it's not the case, even given what might be a compelling interest to allow people to marry heterosexual and homosexual alike. Even that being the case, surely we're not suggesting that any church or synagogue could ever be compelled to allow that to take place. So we know there are going to be lines that have to be drawn somewhere. And one of the lines that has been suggested, and I'm not arguing for this so much as wanting to get it out there, is there's a difference between saying we're going to discriminate against a particular group, we're going to discriminate against gays, which is against the law in many places and ought to be. On the other hand, what about those who feel that somehow they're being involved in a ceremony, in an expression, in a form of expression that's contrary to their deeply held beliefs? So the question, I think, is going to be, where do we draw those lines?
Right.
How do we protect the ability of people to be true to their faith in a way that doesn't make them into pariahs or force them to do something that is religiously unacceptable to them? And on the other hand, recognize that even religious belief can't be protected absolutely, that there are going to be circumstances where there is that compelling interest that will require actions that an individual or a group didn't want to be involved in. So I think that's really the challenge for all of us if we're going to maintain a society where people are going to be able to have those fundamental differences and yet still function together. Individuals will be able to earn livelihoods. We'll all be able to work in the same workplace and go to the same schools, notwithstanding those very significant differences.
Thank you for clarifying that for me. I certainly didn't mean to suggest that houses of worship should ever be coerced to not follow their practices.
Well, we've tackled a few complicated questions. Not sure we answered them all, but now we'll answer your questions. So we have 2 mics. If you'd like to ask a question, please identify yourself and direct your question to a person or just in general.
Hi, my name is Zach Ford. I write for Think Progress. This is a question for anybody who wants to take it, but we've talked a lot about accommodating employees in terms of their religious beliefs. We haven't talked a lot about protecting employees from the employer's religious beliefs, and certainly Hobby Lobby is something that has really set some new and troubling precedents in terms of how an employer can force their beliefs and deprive their employees of access to certain privileges as a result of those beliefs. And so I'm just curious if you feel that being a company that contributes or commits to being religiously free, if that includes protecting employees from that kind of imposition.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure everybody would summarize the case in that same way. So maybe if we could get another summary of the case from whoever's most familiar with the case, and then discuss the issue. Who's our expert up here?
Well, I would just simply offer that go back to maybe the way to resolve some of this is communication. I'm familiar with the Hobby Lobby case, but if I were an atheist and I wanted to get a job, I think I should be able to ask Hobby Lobby for a job, but Hobby Lobby should be telling me what their standards are, and so I can make a decision about employment. If I'm a Mormon and I want to work for Notre Dame, I ought to be respectful of Catholic practices and beliefs, and be comfortable in working in that situation. So I think, again, it comes back to a communication that really lies with the employer and the employee to make sure that things are understood in the beginning as best as possible.
I agree. I think communication is certainly important, but I don't think it gets you all the way there.
No.
So, for example, there have been cases in which employers have insisted that, for example, they have a religious right to pay women less because of the biblical command that men should be the head of households. And whether or not that was communicated to the employees going in, that's still unlawful, and the courts found that it was unlawful, notwithstanding the employer's beliefs. So I do think that there comes a point at which an employer cannot insist on its faith controlling the workplace to such an extent that, for example, it deprives employees of legal benefits.
Yeah, well, just on the Hobby Lobby case, while we, just to be clear, my organization filed in support of the government, in support of requiring that employer to comply with the healthcare obligations that were set forth by HHS. Notwithstanding that, because the court didn't do what we urged them to do, the court found that in fact there was a way to meet both those interests, that there was a way both to provide women with the access to services that were required under the healthcare regulations, and also to accommodate the interests of the employer. Now, there are plenty of folks who have questioned the workability of that accommodation, and we're going to see whether it works or not. But I think whatever we think of the court's ruling in that case, the inclination to try to find a way, if at all possible, both to respect the religious conscience interests, even of an employer, this being a closely held corporation, not, it's questionable that a large public corporation could have a religious liberty interest to vindicate it all. But we're dealing here with a case where the court found there was such a religious liberty interest. So I think that inclination to see if you can't do both, ensure that the other important interests are satisfied at the same time that we're respecting religious liberty, is the way to go.
Yeah.
Of course, there is now pending in the Supreme Court yet another case growing out of Hobby Lobby, which puts even into sharper focus whether or not the employer will be able to be accommodated in the ways it's asking. But I think that should be the first inclination, just to see if you can meet both of those interests.
Right.
Another question?
Hi, my name's Luann Sabatier, and I work with former Congressman Wolf at the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative. My question is going back to the pledge. A lot of the discussion is reactive, and the purpose of the pledge is to be proactive. In America, if you are not a religious or a constitutional scholar, a business owner, how are you supposed to know about the first freedom? I find that we're illiterate when it comes to the first freedom. So how are you going to move this pledge out beyond the traditional circles? Is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Is the National Federation of Independent Business? Is Freedom Partners, which represents 200 corporate businesses? What can be done, and what's the game plan so people know about this? You can't have dialogue if you don't know the dialogue should exist. And so what I think is they don't have dialogue. It results in miscommunication and litigation. So what's the game plan, Brian?
Yeah, thanks.
That's a great comment.
Sorry. By the way, I'm deeply interested in this, so I didn't mean to bait you.
Well, the game plan so far has been to try to build consensus around some general statements that are proactive. And not so if we had a year ago said, okay, when we've got the first draft of this out, said, okay, this is what we're going to go with, we think it's the best, then we would have run into a lot of good hurdles that have been raised along the way. So I think that's really where this project is at right now. It's still looking for feedback, and what you have in front of you can still be modified. And then once we have a consensus built, some businesses that are interested, and then start to roll it out with some companies saying, this makes sense. And so that's part of the game plan.
I just also want to say that this proactive approach is actually happening among many multinational corporations who I suspect will be very interested in being part of this type of pledge. So we have a corporate membership program where we work with companies who have actually committed to looking at their policies and their practices proactively and are changing them today to make sure that they are looking for every way to balance and accommodate each and every belief in their workplace to the greatest extent that they can, and still move forward, having happier employees and more successful businesses. And the business case itself is the reason why it's in their interest to do it. It is actually good for their bottom line.
And hopefully, Brian, having this structure, once this is finalized, for the companies, as you said, who want to do the right thing, this actually helps them move in that direction, so they don't necessarily have to have their lawyers come up with their own individual strategy. This can at least be a good launching point to help them do the right thing.
Yeah. Well, we invite you to stay part of this conversation. Keep in touch with me. Those who have presented here, we anticipate and plan to carry this forward. And I thank you for coming. And I'd like Charles to wisely wrap us up.
I don't know how wise I'm going to be, but I will say this, that to borrow from the charter and Oz's wonderful language, if we're going to live with our deepest differences in this country as we go forward, if we're going to forge a common vision of the common good, and be this model of living with religious differences, this is going to have to be where we focus. One of the areas we're going to have to get this right in our workplaces. And so that's why I think this is an extremely important conversation. We videotaped it, so this will not be the end of this conversation today. We will use this because I hope that you agree with me. We could not have had a better panel than we had this morning. This is just unbelievably insightful and helpful. We had just the right folks. And I also want to say, I think we had one of the most personal, heartfelt, and really visionary keynote talks I've heard in a long time on this issue from Senator Smith. It was just absolutely wonderful. And finally, I think I need to end by saying a special thank you to Brian Grimm. I think many of you know Brian and his work and have for years, but those of you who are learning about it today, I think you now understand. When you first see religious freedom and business foundation, you think, what? Why? It's such a strange niche to carve out. But actually, it turns out to be a very large agenda, a very ambitious agenda, not only for this country, but for countries around the world. And we often think of these things in terms of what lawyers and judges are going to do for us in the courts and so forth, and that's all important. But we forget that the real difference for religious freedom in the future is going to be where we work and where we're educated and where we live. That's either going to sustain religious freedom or not, how we do in those arenas, because all the lawyers and judges in the world will not create that environment for freedom unless we take it seriously in our lives, our homes, and our workplaces. And Brian is a visionary, as Joyce said in the beginning, to see the importance of making these connections for people. And he's really gotten a lot of people excited and interested in an issue that I think otherwise would not have been addressed. So we're deeply grateful to his leadership on this corporate pledge, which I think is going to have tremendous life and have a great impact in many communities in this country and around the world. So I'll end by saying a big thank you to Brian Grimm. Thank you all for being here this morning.
Thanks.